Hello and welcome to Underscored, a podcast brought to you by Young Voices. I'm your host, Stephen Kent. It's impeachment week. As you're listening to this, House Dems have announced a formal impeachment inquiry. Things are about to get real for this White House, and we're going to get into this and more with my guest panel, Haley Smith of Young Voices and a fellow at USA Today, and Shaun, Cammack, Young Voices and a freelance political writer. First, Greta Thunberg versus the world. Well, she says she's fighting for the world, but she's not too happy with who is running it. The climate strike had a big week, and the backlash against it got a little too heated.
We need to deal with ideas before we deal with the identity of the people speaking the ideas. The identity is kind of irrelevant. It doesn't really matter if it's a 16-year-old kid or a 90-year-old.
Then, impeachment. What's going to happen here with the House versus President Trump? Your guess is as good as mine, but we do know it's not looking good for this White House.
Impeachment proceedings are a very big deal. And if they aren't able to go through, that's not something that the Democrats are just going to be able to throw away.
And lastly, the appeal of Andrew Yang, the oddball Democratic candidate for president. Shaun is going to discuss his recent piece in Spiked about the surprising appeal of Yang to really a wide swath of Americans based on his inclination to not get involved in the culture war. It is a breath of fresh air. Shaun's going to explain why.
We are vindictive and mean when people make faux pas or just make silly jokes. It's this sort of cancel culture that if you've ever said anything remotely offensive, then you need to never have a job again. And what Andrew Yang said is no.
All right, with that, let's dive in. So I want to start with Greta Thunberg and her address to the UN yesterday that garnered a very heated response. I think from both her supporters and her opponents. It was a news cycle today generated much by the right overstepping on their criticism of Greta based on her speech to the UN. There was a lot of conversation about this young 16-year-old who is autistic, has OCD, all sorts of different nervous disorders, as being in many ways unqualified to weigh in on these issues and guide public conversation, that she is a puppet, that she is being used. And just recently, it was reported that Daily Wire's Michael Knowles was basically booted from being booked in the future by Fox News for saying that she is mentally ill. And for that reason, we should not be taking her seriously and taking her advice from the UN on climate. So, Shaun, what do you sort of make of this entire ordeal with Greta and climate action? How should we be thinking about this level of political activism engagement by an autistic 16-year-old who thinks that the world is going to end in the next decade?
Yeah, well, she's a child, and let's remember that first and foremost. And that's not to say, her views are wrong because she's a child, but I really tend to try and pull my punches when we're talking about someone with little experience and who is so young. First and foremost, there's that. I think, having said that, I think that she's being used a little bit as a pawn. And there's something that if you use a kid to promote your idea, whenever anyone criticizes the idea, you can say, hey, well, don't bully the kid. It's well, you put the kid there. So I would just say, it's a little bit dishonest on both sides. I would say that for sure.
Yeah, I would say I agree with this. I think that, both sides have a tendency to do this, right? You see someone who's a child who's inspiring and, oh, look, they agree with what I have to say, and the next generation is going to carry the torch. So we need to kind of promote them and say, yeah, what they're saying is spectacular and make a platform for them. And so it's definitely not just Democrats who do this, but, they're in the spotlight right now for this particular instance. And I just think it is definitely, even if every single person that promotes her stuff does not think that they are or consciously think that they are using her as a pawn, that's certainly the way that she functions. And you can kind of use a kid as a get out of jail free card because it's really hard to criticize a kid. And so, you see this happening with Michael Knowles. I think that I think there was definitely a way that he could have said what he said more delicately, but the idea that he pointed out facts, the fact that she, yes, struggles with mental illness, and that, yes, she is a child, the idea that is somehow so egregious, I think is wrong. And it's just, I don't know, this is something that bothers me a little bit, this idea that, okay, you can never criticize someone who is put before the world as kind of this political spokesman.
It does seem to me that everybody is very eager to use kids to their advantage when it comes to politics. You see this happen a whole lot on the gun control issue, and some of the survivors from, which school was it down south
Parkland.
in Florida? Yeah, the Parkland kids, where, the right, simultaneously while criticizing sort of the leaders like David Hogg of that and saying like, hey, these are children, why should we be listening to them on gun control just because they survived a shooting? Why do they have some sort of high ground? Oh, well, we have one who agrees with us named Kyle Kashuv, and now he's an expert somehow on gun rights. I think everybody just sort of wants to have these sort of unimpeachable avatars for their own pet issues. But I don't really buy the idea that Greta is being used. There's been some sort of conversation about her parents being actors or something like that. But isn't this just something that she is incredibly, incredibly fixated on? Maybe just by, Go ahead, Shaun.
Fair enough. Sorry, Stephen. Fair enough. I mean, and something to be clear is that we need to deal with ideas before we deal with like the identity of the people speaking the ideas. The identity is kind of irrelevant. It doesn't really matter if it's a 16-year-old kid or a 90-year-old. The ideas need to be able to stand on their own merits, and perhaps what she's saying have some merits. I think some things they don't. The only thing I would, with regards to Michael Knowles, he's not wrong to point out that she has, she's, let's say, on the autism spectrum or has OCD, but that doesn't disqualify her from speaking on things. I mean, I'm at the University of Chicago. A lot of people here are on the autism spectrum and are extremely competent academics. So that's kind of a if that is the criticism that he's making, that's a little bit cheap. But like I said, the ideas need to be able to stand on their own merit.
Right. I think the only issue that I have with the Michael Knowles situation is just the idea that, okay, now we are going to censor people for stating facts. That's kind of been the headline is Michael Knowles calls Greta Thunberg a mentally ill child. And that to me is not incorrect, and that's not a reason to censor someone.
I disagree with this a little bit. I don't think that we typically refer to people with these kinds of disorders as the mentally ill. I think you are technically, and I want to be clear, technically correct, but sort of in common speak, in the way in which you talk to sort of parents with kids who have these sort of disorders, they don't list them as being mentally ill. They say they have special needs. They say they have disorders, they have deficits or learning challenges. I don't think it's really appropriate to be sort of gauging people's ability to engage in politics based on, quote, mental illness. That sort of seems like really stigma.
And I actually agree with you on this. I mean, also, I'm not, this is not something that I have had to personally deal with. So I'm willing to be convinced on what the proper terminology should be here. The point that I'm trying to make is I don't really know that Michael Knowles was necessarily saying she struggles with these things, therefore she shouldn't be able to speak. I think what he was more trying to make the point of was, look, she has, she's a child, she has this mental illness, and that makes her more of, like I was saying before, more of a get out of jail free card for Democrats, right? And so, I mean, this is a hard situation, I think, and I don't know that there's any one easy, simple answer to it, but I do think it just seems to me to be a little bit of an overreaction.
Yeah. So I want to propose an answer. Why don't partisans in this sort of context simply just shrug and walk away? Why is there a need with like Greta Thunberg and, a speech given at the UN? Why does that need to be like a call to arms by the opposition? Why does like Fox have to spend an entire day talking about this and the Daily Wire going off about Greta? Why don't we just walk away? Like, the UN has no power. This child is not going to do anything of any significance to anybody's lives. Why does it have to be combat?
Well, we have to contest the ideas. Like, if it's irrelevant, her identity, her whomever she is, that's not really relevant. Her ideas are relevant. And if she has bad ideas, regardless of who she is, the ideas need to be contested and the ideas need to be discussed. But the point that she's a 16-year-old, is that really all that relevant? I don't really think so.
Absolutely. These doomsday prophecies have been around for 50 years, right? Maybe it's time to just confront those and do away with them. Sorry, go ahead, Haley.
No, absolutely. I think the line here is exactly what Shaun is saying, is that you have to confront the policies. So I think when you're dealing with, and maybe this should be how we deal with anyone, but that's probably unrealistic. But particularly the way that we deal with children is, you can criticize the content of what they say without making personal attacks. You can criticize the content of what they say without attacking their appearance or the way that they deliver their content. All of that sort of stuff can be left aside. And I think that's what the right has not done in large part. I mean, Michael Knowles is not the most egregious example of what has been said about this little girl, even on Fox News. And so to kind of make him into this sort of scapegoat, I think it's a little bit ridiculous.
I think he got thrown under the bus. Absolutely.
Yes,
absolutely. I agree. It's an overreaction.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah, well, I think in the context of Fox, you've got a lot of hosts and a lot of paid contributors who are saying pretty wild and ugly things throughout the day. And Michael Knowles is an occasional guest who they can do away with and sort of blame for the tone of the day. I think there is something of a throwing under the bus going on there. Now, I want to turn to the big guiding news of today that is really just now breaking as we are having this conversation. It's impeachment. The Democrats are moving forward and have majority support in the caucus to do an impeachment inquiry against Trump over his phone call with the president of the Ukraine, basically holding over the head of that president military aid and funding for their country in exchange for more scrutiny on Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, and some of his dealings with the oil industry while Joe Biden was the vice president. This is pretty scummy stuff. And where should we begin? I want to kick it over to Haley. Did you actually see this eventually coming, that we were going to get an impeachment inquiry against the president? Because I had been convinced that this was not going to happen, that the Democrats did not have the political courage to do it.
So, I was convinced that the wings of the party, or that the very leftist parts of the party, were going to continue pushing for this. And slowly, everything that's on the left ends up becoming more mainstream for Democrats. I am very surprised that Nancy Pelosi is willing to go for it. I think that these latest allegations are really what has motivated her to do it. But there are people that are definitely out there, even in USA Today, saying, hey, look, if we're going to talk about impeachment, we need to talk about it now in order to avoid it conflicting with 2020. So I'm thinking they want to do this now, get it out of the way, so that way it hopefully doesn't have a lasting impact. I don't know that that's really a realistic calculation. Impeachment proceedings are a very big deal. And if they aren't able to go through, that's not something that the Democrats are just going to be able to throw away. But I do think it would have been a little bit politically dishonest for Democrats to have waited until after 2020 and then said, oh, yeah, he's president again. I guess we'll pursue impeachment now. And that would have seemed, I think that would have seemed very, very much like a political calculus. So I don't know. I was surprised by this a little, but there are certainly some signs that we're pointing towards it.
Yeah, I got to tell you, I am so sick of all the impeachment talk. It's been 3 years now that we've been pounding the war drum of impeachment. Like, look, if the president did something impeachable, like if there is a quid pro quo here, he should be impeached, no question. But I don't really think that the American electorate really cares anymore. Like, this has been factored in. Maybe I'm wrong on this. Maybe this is the thing that really, energizes the voter, not the Mueller report, but this will be the one that does it. I'm just kind of over it. Just do it. If you're going to impeach, and if there's something worth impeaching, I mean, to be clear, go for it. But
yeah, I don't want to be too much of a cynic here, but with this president and sort of his level of unpopularity, he really can't break 50% approval for his administration. I think the last poll that I saw this morning had him down somewhere like by 42. Does it really matter if the public supports it? If Congress sees clear wrongdoing and signs of corruption, don't they have a duty, as far as the Constitution and balance of power goes, to pull the trigger on impeachment?
Fair enough. And I totally agree with you there. Like, if that they don't have to sway the public opinion to do their duty, and nor should they. But yeah, I don't know. I like I said, if there's something worth impeaching, impeach. But I think they also have to be careful, because if they fail here, I think that could work in Trump's favor. It would, if they file the articles of impeachment and they fail this process, that might validate Trump's claims that the big government is just a witch hunt out to get him. So I think they have to be mindful of that.
I think also Democrats, in my opinion, based on, Stephen, what you were saying there, Democrats are kind of the ones that come across looking like hypocrites, like particularly Nancy Pelosi, because she hasn't denied up until now that what was found in the Mueller report constituted an impeachable offense. She, as far as I know, she hasn't been saying, oh, no, I don't think that constitutes what we could impeach for. In this instance, if this is the thing, if Ukraine is the thing where now she says, okay, yeah, we're going to impeach based upon this thing, she is the one that comes off looking like a hypocrite, not her colleagues to the left, and also not Republicans that potentially decide that they're going to go along with impeachment as well, because you kind of have to deal with these situations on an individual basis. And I think that Nancy Pelosi, above everyone, has been the one making political calculuses here, or political calculations, not necessarily those on the left or Republicans.
I think it might be worth noting that, the House has the ability to file impeachment against the president and sort of hold him in contempt in this way. But the Senate is in control of actually pulling the trigger on the removal of a president. Yeah. So, it's never going to happen. They don't really need Republicans to impeach the president. They need Republicans to remove him. And I think in the past, what we've had happen with every impeachment is that then presidents resign. So the Senate never even had to act. But, one Democratic presidential candidate has taken until the last hour to really take a hard stance on the issue of impeachment. And that is Andrew Yang. He just tweeted.
What a transition.
Oh, I know. I nailed it here. So given the president's latest actions, I think impeachment is the right path going forward. Asking foreign leaders for political help in return for aid and then suppressing your own agency's inquiry is egregious. There have to be limits, and Congress is right to act. Hard to disagree with Andrew Yang there, but I want to backpedal here to a piece that our guest here, Shaun, wrote about Andrew Yang in Spiked about the appeal of Andrew Yang across political lines over the stands that he's been taking on cultural issues. And this was the flashpoint that surrounded a comedian that SNL hired and then fired over racist comments that had something to do with Andrew Yang. that he probably, shouldn't have said, but, was crude and it was comedy. And Andrew Yang came to his defense over the firing and said, hey, this person actually shouldn't lose their job. Shaun, I don't want to steal your thunder. Feel free to tell us a little bit about your piece, what you wrote, and why Andrew Yang has this broad appeal. And then I'd love to discuss it.
Yeah, sounds good. So, I've been very impressed with the authenticity of Andrew Yang, and there's been a word every time I see him on these debates. There's a word that pops up in my head, and that's impishness. He's kind of naughty and fun with some of the jokes that he makes on stage at the Democratic debate. He says. He's Asian, so he likes math, or he's Asian, so he knows a lot of doctors. And these are fun little throwaway impish jokes that I think really, frankly, endear him to me. It seems fun, but I was really impressed with how he handled the whole SNL Shane Gillis debacle. So, Shane Gillis made some jokes that I don't even call them racist jokes, because I think intent is that important to determine whether or not something is a racist comment. But he certainly made racial jokes that use slurs. I mean, that's what he did. And they were crude and they weren't very funny. They came off as kind of edgelord internet humor, whatever. And there was this big to-do because SNL also had just hired their first Asian American cast member at the same time. So there's this kind of perfect storm of people saying, well, you've just hired your first Asian American cast member, but you've also just hired Shane Gillis, who used ethnic slurs. So there's a big to-do for that reason. But Andrew Yang comes out first in a Twitter thread and then on with Jake Tapper. And I think he's talked about it since, about how comedians, clearly the words that he uses are that our society has become excessively punitive and vengeful. And straight from the horse's mouth. That's beautiful. That is exactly what I think has been going. We are vindictive and mean when people make faux pas or just make silly jokes. It's this sort of cancel culture that if you've ever said anything remotely offensive, then you need to never have a job again. And what Andrew Yang said is like, no, we need to be more sober. We need to be more understanding about this. And especially for comedians, they need to be held to a different standard. They're just trying to make people laugh. And I was wildly impressed with that. And I still am.
Yeah. So Andrew Yang came to visit our editorial board. He spoke to us last week. And by the way, I did not speak on behalf of the board, but on behalf of myself. And I really felt like, coming into this, that Andrew Yang, when you ask conservatives, who is the Democratic candidate that would be like the least offensive to you, they, by and large, will answer Andrew Yang. And I asked him about this, and I said, because he had been saying things like, well, I kind of think that, when I talk about things like his policy for universal basic income, and I lay it out for conservatives, and it's appealing to these types of voters that, were vote switchers and moved over to Trump and yada, yada, yada. And I said to him, when I mentioned that fact that most people will say, yeah, I would choose Andrew Yang. He says, yes, see, and that's why we're going to win. And I addressed this with him and I said, okay, so when I talk to them, though, the thing that they don't mention as being your appeal is your policies. They focus more on your general demeanor. And when I said that, he seemed a little taken aback, like maybe he hadn't fully considered that. And I said, I think people feel like you are kind of the one candidate in the race who doesn't view them with utter contempt. People are not going to vote for someone who hates them, right? And this is just a very visceral thing that I think people pay attention to. So I think as far as his appeal generally, I think he is a really, really likable person. But I think he was kind of sold a little bit as more of a moderate. I would say he's tempered, but he's not moderate. Right. So many of his policies are still very extreme. And I think that's something that conservatives have to pay attention to. It's like, look, guys, this obviously is not the alternative to Donald Trump. As far as policies go.
I think Haley, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, just the power of not operating in the politics of contempt can take you a long way in offering 100%. Incredibly radical proposals. I mean, Andrew Yang's proposals, both as an anathema to the left and the right, are a radical departure from the way American politics, society, and government would function. I mean, not only does he want to kind of overhaul what welfare is and how exactly be distributed, that would also come with getting rid of the way that welfare currently works and
100%.
thousands upon thousands of bureaucrats in government. Shaun,
and can I say one more thing about that? Is that cool?
Yeah.
So his policy, his universal basic income would cost $2 trillion. I'm pretty sure, if I'm getting this correct. It would cost a couple $1 trillion. And the way he proposes funding it is partly through this value-added tax, which, it could take some time to explain. But that's essentially the way he figures we're going to get money now out of Amazon and, more of these bigger tech companies. And one of the interesting things that he was asked during our board meeting was, if the value-added tax doesn't pass, but UBI does, will you still go ahead with UBI? And he said, yes. Like, he was just very conclusive about it. So, we're talking about something where we could be going, trillions and trillions of dollars more into debt, to pay for something that we don't have the money for. So that's just kind of one example of this central policy that he, is definitely not a moderate on.
That's funny he would say that. I mean, just as like a political strategist, I would just tell him, like, just answer that question and say, like, you know what, we're going to bundle the two things together in one session, and it's going to happen. It's going to happen at the same time. So don't worry about that.
It's going to pass through that Republican Senate. No problem.
No problem. Shaun, I was reading a profile, not really a profile, but a long piece in The Atlantic about Andrew Yang the other day, really sort of calling into question the analogy around Donald Trump that has been used for several years now, that he sort of is the successor to Ross Perot's candidacy, and sort of the everyday American appeal and the focus on math, numbers, and economics, and not tribal politics. And this piece sort of rejects that framing that Donald Trump somehow is the successor to that, which has never really made sense to me, and that Andrew Yang actually is the successor to Ross Perot's independent presidency. What do you make of that analogy? And do you think that that Andrew Yang might endure and carry on after the Democratic primary?
Oh man, I tell you, I don't know. I don't know if he does. I mean, he's so dang likable. I can't see how he disappears after the Democratic primary. Really, and I think this is his big appeal again. And I agree with Haley on his policies. A lot of his policies, I think, are way too radical and way too big for me. But there's this authenticity about him. It's like, that's the only guy on stage that I feel like isn't trying to lie to me. And I feel like that's what a lot of people see in him. It's like, that's just a dude. That's just a dude who's got some ideas. You can hang out with him. Like Haley says, he doesn't hate you. He's just a guy with some ideas that policies, proposals that I disagree with, but I'd hang out with him. Seems fun. But does he have life after the primary? Man, I hope so. I mean, I think he'd be pretty good. He's a pretty good presence to have in the conversation. This sort of sober, fun, smart person that doesn't take himself too seriously. I think we are lacking that.
I agree. I don't know if this will mean anything, but one of the interesting observations I've found about like meeting him in person. So when going through the whole election cycle, I did not understand the appeal of President Trump. I just didn't get it. I mean, I'm not from Middle America. I'm from kind of, a more rural area of California. But, I'm not from the types of communities that I think that he has a real appeal in. But I didn't really get his appeal as kind of the suburban woman. It just didn't make a lot of sense to me. And I thought he was crude, and I didn't really like that. And when I saw him speak at CPAC, where I think he spoke for like 3 hours, when I saw him speak in person there for the first time, I finally went. The moment he walked on stage, I went, I get it. Like, it makes sense now. You see him in person, you're there in the room with everyone else laughing, and the dude's actually kind of funny, and it makes sense. With Andrew Yang, I've watched him, and I thought I understood his appeal online, and I was like, man, I think this guy is really, really interesting, and he's likable, as Shaun said. And then when I met him in person, I'm not going to say that, like, oh, now all of a sudden I don't think he's likable, but the appeal kind of wore off. And I don't know how else to describe that. It's just, I didn't get the same sense from him in person that I did online.
Interesting.
Yeah.
See, I actually think there's quite a lot of similarities between the appeal of Andrew Yang and the appeal of Donald Trump. I think that sort of everyman, like Andrew Yang doesn't wear a tie on stage, right? This is a little thing, but I think it's bigger than what it is. Like, he's a guy that doesn't take himself too seriously. And look at Donald Trump. I mean, that's a crude, like you said, that's crude. I think very funny, clunky guy who, some of his policies I don't really get. A lot of his policies I don't get on with. But Donald Trump, I mean, yeah, I'd sit down and have a beer with him. He'd probably have some funny stories. And that is a very similar appeal I think there is to Andrew Yang. Now, I've never met Andrew Yang in person. Maybe he's just the best liar on stage. But I tend to think he is still a pretty authentic guy.
I think so too. And I think this is what a lot of people said about Reagan, right? Was the idea that, he would get on and do these stump speeches and he would wear these suits that like apparently weren't very presidential. And he would have donors calling him to say, you need to put him in a Navy suit so that he looks like a president, and he would go out and he would talk to people and have genuine conversations and he would make jokes and people liked him and they thought this guy genuinely cares about Americans and he's not, this hyper partisan person, even though he had very, very, very conservative policies, more conservative policies than the country had really ever in modern history seen. And I think that is that's an important thing in politics. And I think people don't tend to understand how important it actually is.
All right, you heard it here first. Haley Smith, Andrew Yang is like Ronald Reagan.
No, that is not tomorrow's deadline.
All right, guys, thank you so much for joining me on Underscore today. This was an excellent conversation. I appreciate both of you giving me your time. You can find our guests Haley Smith and Shaun on Twitter at Haley_Victory. That's Haley_Victory. And Shaun at Shaun J. Cammack. That's SHAUNJ Cammack. I'll put that in the show notes so you can follow the both of them. We'll be back next week with more on the Underscored podcast. Maybe then we will have President Pence. No, I don't. Things will not move that fast. But until then, stay free.